Good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Okay?
No, I'm not.
Okay, excellent. So good afternoon, actually, and to everyone joining us here in the Rose Conference Room here at Duke University Stanford School of Public Policy. We welcome you to Redistricting American Democracy. We're excited to kick off the in-person sessions of day 2 of our conference. And we want to start by expressing our thanks to Stanford's Dean Edith Kelly and the Senior Associate Dean Phil Napoli for including our session in the Wednesdays at Stanford series. And to all the students, staff, and faculty who are with us now, we want to give a special shout out. I'm Deondra Rose. I'm an Associate Professor of Public Policy, Political Science, and History here at Duke University. And I'm the Director of Policy Center for Politics. We're really excited that this session will be the start of, or actually a continuation of our discussions from yesterday. And this is our 4th session. It is titled Building Bipartisan Support for Redistricting Reform. And yesterday, we've heard from a number of scholars, activists, journalists who weighed in on the biggest questions surrounding democracy and redistricting. And today, we're going to turn to politics. The very thing that reformers are trying to get out of redistricting, incidentally. We're really fortunate to have here with us today 2 people who have been central players in the quest for redistricting here in North Carolina. We've got Art Pope and Tom Ross. Art Pope is the chairman of the John William Pope Foundation and of Variety Wholesalers, a private family health business that is headquartered in Henderson, North Carolina. Among Mr. Pope's many previous roles, he served 4 terms in the North Carolina House of Representatives, served as special counsel to Governor Jim Martin, and served for nearly 2 years as state budget director during Governor Pat McCrory's administration. He's also actively engaged in civic service as a member of numerous boards of directors. Mr. Pope earned his BA with honors in political science from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and in 1981, he received his JD right across the street at the Duke University Law School. Tom Ross is president of the Volcker Alliance and co-chair of North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform. He's also president emeritus of the 17th Campus University of North Carolina System Schools, and he served as president from 2011 to 2016. Prior to becoming the president of the UNC system, Mr. Ross's numerous roles include serving as president of Davidson College, executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, a Superior Court judge, and chief of staff to a U.S. congressman. He was also an assistant professor of public law and government at UNC Chapel Hill. Mr. Ross earned his BA, also in political science, from Davidson College in 1972 and graduated with honors from the UNC Chapel Hill School of Law in 1975. So Art, Tom, welcome.
Thank you.
So I have a number of questions for you, but I also want to invite our audience members to be thinking of questions that they would like to ask you at any point in the conversation. We will welcome audience questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the hour. We also invite anyone tuning in a Zoom webinar to please use the Q&A function to submit their questions, and a member of our team will relay them to us during the Q&A session. So to start off, how did you get involved in redistricting to begin with? And why do you think this issue is significant?
I got involved in 1980. I was chairman of our local party, and at that point, Democrats were in the legislature, and I got a call from somebody down there, I don't remember who said, this was back when all the districts had to be within a county, you couldn't break county lines. So they called me and they said, we want you to pull together Guilford County and draw us a map of districts for Guilford County and send it back. So we didn't have the benefit of computers in those days, so we got a legal pad, got the population data for each precinct. We didn't break precincts in those days either. And sat down at a lobby of a bank on Sunday afternoon and drew the districts instead of Robert legislation. I mean, it wasn't nearly as technical or not near as many people involved as it is now, because again, you couldn't break county lines and precinct lines, so you were pretty well restricted by those two factors. And in those days, people drew lines and still do, protect the comments. So that's the first time I was exposed really to the issue. And as I went along, I thought how unfair that was, you know, and over time grew more interested in the issue and reform. Then when I left UNC, one of the little pieces of work that you left out was I came to Duke University, to the Sanford School, and worked here for a while as the Terry Sanford fellow, and was working here on redistricting reform, and got increasingly interested in alternative ways to do this, and you know, really worried about which partisan gerrymandering was undermining democracy. And so we pulled together a group, you know, that's actually co-sponsored by co-invitees were Governor Martin and Governor Hunt. And we pulled together, you know, about 100 people or so here at Duke, I think in this room, and talked about redistricting reform and what would be needed, what we could agree on, what we couldn't agree on, what we should do about it. And we ended up creating out of that eventually the North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform, which is a bipartisan effort focused on reform, particularly non-partisan reform, partisan redistricting reform in North Carolina. So I've been interested in and involved in the issue for a long time. Probably not as long as I, but
that actually started a little bit later than you did.
The acoustics in this room are a little tricky for the online crowd. Would you mind speaking into that?
So I got started a little bit, I'm a little bit young at the top, so I got started a little bit later. So in 1989, I was a freshman Republican in the legislature and co-sponsored legislation in '89 for nonpartisan redistricting through a constitutional amendment, co-sponsored Representative Paul Stam. And our approach and hope then is that even though we were in a minority, we're actually part of a majority coalition under Speaker Matt Reddick with Democrats and Republicans, that not knowing for certain who was going to be in majority in 1991 after the 90 census taking, that we persuade both parties within their interest to adopt rules or constitutional amendment that would be binding to government redistricting going forward. We were not successful. Jump ahead to 1999, I was in the legislature again to this legislation for nonpartisan redistricting. Again, it was not successful. And while I was not in the legislature in 2009, there were several Republican bills for nonpartisan redistricting through constitutional amendment, and none of them were taken up. Now, I do want to give a shout out to Senator Ham Horton, who just passed away, but he was a leading proponent on the Senate side for nonpartisan redistricting. When we didn't get nonpartisan redistricting heard, much less passed, during the 91 session and 2001 session, I was a hands-on map drawer. And it was a little bit better than when Tom did it. But for those of you who do any map drawing, not only do we not have algorithms, the servers, the workstation were so slow that most of the time I did my work on paper maps and pad with a calculator before entering it onto the computer system. And for the record, everything I did was on legislative computers. It became public record. So I do have firsthand experience in 2 sessions with drawing maps, trying to build a consensus among my caucus, negotiating with the Democrats, with various factions within the Democrat Party on entire maps and specific amendments to try and make some districts more rational or reasonable. So I'm not merely have seen inside the sausage factory, I was there participating. When we were not, now I'll go ahead and say it up front. What we were also doing, what I was doing, I was trying to draw a map to show alternatives, to build a record to challenge what we expected to be either unconstitutional or violation of the Voting Rights Act maps enacted by the Democrat majority. So indeed, in 91, 92, then again, 2001, 2002, We filed objections with the Justice Department saying that the maps violated the Voting Rights Act, should not be pre-cleared. We're actually successful both times. Then filed litigation. In the first case, I was the lead plaintiff in. It's a case called Pope v. Blue in 1991-92. And it was a federal case holding that under the Vandermeer decision, that the enacted U.S. congressional plan was a violation of equal protection, various First Amendment claims, and should be set aside. And I listened to Judge Wynn last night, very sympathetic to him being overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court and the plaintiffs there, because their claims in the Rucho case were very similar to our claims in the Pope v. Blue case. We also lost though. We were thrown out on Rule 12b-6, failure to state a claim, in a 3-judge panel headed by the Chief Fourth Circuit Judge then, Judge Sam Murphy. So the Supreme Court decision is really consistent with what's been going on for 20 years. But I'm sympathetic, but just as Rucho plaintiffs did not succeed this time, we didn't succeed. I personally then participated as the lead plaintiff intervener in a litigation called the Shaw cases. The original case was brought by Judge Robinson Everett, professor at Duke Law School, that basically held that the very strange I-85 district, and I handed out a map for those of you who have not seen it, was a racial gerrymander. And that district went from Gastonia to Charlotte, then from Charlotte not only to Greensboro, but then west to Winston-Salem and east to Durham. And as plaintiff intervener, we kind of combined that with the reason it was not narrowly tailored in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act was for partisan reasons. And to an extent, we were successful. That's one of the first cases to recognize racial gerrymandering as a justiciable claim. In fact, it was the very first case cited in the Covington case in this recent round of litigation. So I do think through litigation, we did see some success in limiting the outcome of use of racial gerrymandering to limit the use of racial gerrymandering. Fast forward in 2001, when the Democrats majority party passed their redistricting plans, I was a plaintiff in the Stevenson litigation, which held that the North Carolina should honor its constitution, its whole county provision, harmonize and subordinate to the federal law, equal protection, one person, one vote, and the Voting Rights Act. And we were successful in that litigation, and having to respect a objective standard of the whole county. Oh, I apologize. Was again a restriction on gerrymandering. What we did not ask for as the plaintiffs was single-member districts. In fact, I remember being involved in very large multi-member districts, which I did not like personally, but we thought that's what the Constitution provided. With an amicus brief, there was a call for under equal protection, if you're going to have some single-member districts, all the districts have to be single-member. And the North Carolina Supreme Court made that part of the Stevenson decision, which very much restricted gerrymandering because they have large districts, multi-member large districts were used to subordinate whether it's a partisan minority or a racial minority. That was a very powerful tool that got eliminated. Now, I will make one point about the overall litigation history as well as trying to get redistricting reform. I think on a bipartisan basis, going back to my original point, persuade both political parties that they're better off adopting rules ahead of time out of the Constitution, not knowing who's going to win, is more likely to result in better districts that people choose their legislators or the legislators choosing their voters. We actually used that saying back in the 1990s, and of course it's been used now in the current round of litigation. Likewise, the legislature, I'm a former legislator, they want to comply with the law. They don't want to pass unconstitutional, illegal act that violate the Voting Rights Act or the state constitution or federal constitution. And Democrats back in the early 2000s said, wait a minute, we didn't know that we had to have single member districts. That's a new law. And so we'll comply with that. We know that. Likewise, I think on a lot of the rules, the Republicans would argue some of the standards and legal application of pre-existing law changed, but once they knew what it was, then they would adopt that. But rather, even though I believe in absolutely the right to sue under our state and federal constitution, but rather than having constant litigation determining the outcome, If we can have bipartisan support for constitutional amendment for a process and criteria, the state will be better served, and hopefully we can persuade the General Assembly with that type of referendum for constitutional amendment on the ballot.
Thank you so much. So I want to come back to these political issues in just a moment. But just to step back a little bit and think about this political landscape that we're working through, the institutional landscape we're working with. The Constitution requires that we take a census every 10 years, and then we use those data to reallocate political representation. But it stops short of telling us exactly how to do that and telling the states how to go about doing that work. And so you're doing a lot of work to really change the institution of how we're going about this. Can you tell us a little bit about, your perspective on what real, meaningful, high quality, potentially lasting reform would look like? Like, what's your Cadillac reform? I don't know if Cadillac is the best. Gold standard reform.
Gold standard reform. Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for you, but because I'm not sure that there is a gold standard reform. There's not going to be a perfect solution to where we are. I don't think, unless artificial intelligence has more hope than humans, which it might actually. So maybe artificial intelligence can figure out the gold standard. But I think the first and most importantly are a set of criteria that whoever's drawing the maps has to follow. And personally, I think that means you cannot consider political information, that is party registration, voting history, or in my view, any kind of proxy data that allows you to figure out how people are going to vote, because there's plenty of that out there now, and you have to figure out how to restrict that. And so I think that's one important part. I think districts ought to be drawn to the extent possible that are compact and contiguous, so that they have a reasonable chance of keeping together people who have the same interest. And so I think communities of interest is also an important factor, because what you're really trying to do, I think, with districts is create a place where people's vote matters and where they can actually voice their views. And so to the extent you can keep areas together that have some that face common issues, then I think you're making good progress. I think transparency is very important in this process. The public has to both see what's happening, but also has to have confidence in it. The only way they're going to have confidence in it is to see it with real levels of transparency. So I think that needs to be part of sort of the criteria. Now, I think where we have failed in the past to really, and I don't know if there's a huge amount of disagreement on the criteria for people who support nonpartisan redistricting. There might be some around the edges, but I think the other, of course, you need to comply with federal law and the Voting Rights Act and so forth. But I think where we have failed in the past is to figure out a solution for who draws the maps. And again, I think the most important fact about who draws the maps is to have that be done by people that the public will have confidence in. Personally, I'm not, I support independent redistricting commissions because I think the public will see that as, the people doing the drawing as opposed to the legislators. But the definition of an independent commission is really independent is really going to be hard to figure out how to do it, right? I mean, the selection process of the commissions in and of itself is going to be political. So there's always going to be politics involved. I think you're just trying to minimize it. And you're trying to create a system that the public can have confidence in. But if you have the right criteria, who draws the maps is less important than what those criteria are, in my opinion. And so I think that's the first step to really meaningful reform, and then figure out who's going to do the drawing of the maps. And there's a variety of different ways around the country that's taking place. And, we don't know enough yet from most of those to know how successful they're going to be, because a lot of the independent commissions are still relatively new. The one place where I think we have a long history is Iowa, and where theirs is really an advisory commission, but it's worked actually quite well until this time, which seems to be struggling a little bit this time. So, I don't know whether there is a gold standard, frankly, but because I don't think you'll ever get politics all the way out of this. But the goal ought to be a system that the public has confidence in, that allows everybody's vote to really count, to matter. And that's one of the problems with gerrymandering, is there are large numbers of people that are disenfranchised. I think the other place where we fail is we see this as a two-party issue, Democrats and Republicans against each other, with a third of the population are now unaffiliated, and their voice is often not heard. And so that's another place where we got to figure out a better answer than we have.
Thank you so much.
Now, pretty much agree with everything Tom said. First and foremost, our objective criteria, which govern either the legislature or the redistricting commission, we pretty well set them. Single member districts, one person, one vote, follow county lines in the case of North Carolina legislative districts in our state constitution, and then geographically compact. I also, back in 1989 to today, partisan data should not be considered. I don't think incumbency should be. Where I thought one point in time was going to go. Sometimes very strange districts are not due to partisanship or racial gerrymandering. It's due to one party's favoring its own incumbents, or the leader of the House or Senate favoring their supporters within their own caucus and punishing someone in their caucus who is not their supporter. That's especially true when you have population shifts. The county that loses a population that therefore may lose a seat, then the leadership gets to decide which member is going to keep a seat, most likely return, who's going to be sacrificed. So I think eliminating incumbent protection is important. I am in general support of independent redistricting commission as either the primary role or a initial role presenting to the legislature. But independent redistricting commissions themselves are not an assurance of no gerrymandering. You have states that have independent redistricting commissions that look at the election results. You can argue that they were gerrymandered either inadvertently or on purpose. There's a lot of devils and details that need to be worked out on independent redistricting commissions, and how to choose the members is one of the hardest situations we've seen.
I just add one other thing, and this is something I learned from Jonathan Mattingly here at Duke, and that is, you know, there are ways to actually test what you've done once you draw maps to see are they the best and fairest way, you know. And I think one thing I learned from him is there are vast numbers, thousands of different ways to do this. But if you use the right criteria, often you come up with a pretty narrow band of what the outcomes are. It's when you vary from those criteria that you end up with wide variances. And so that's why I think I've come to the view that the criteria are so important, because that's what keeps the politics, whether it's, you know, racial gerrymandering politics or partisan gerrymandering politics or incumbency or whatever it might be, it narrows it to a very narrow band of difference, of deviation. And that to me is success. And so I think, you know, we really ought to use Jonathan and other brilliant mathematicians that can help us analyze what we're doing in real time to know whether or not we are being as fair to the voting population as we can do.
So, Tom, I've heard you describe gerrymandering as the process of creating safe districts. And basically, we're creating districts where those who are elected essentially only really need to appeal to the people in their party, because the biggest threat to their term in office is being primary, essentially. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role that redistricting, or that gerrymandering in particular, plays in the rise of polarization?
Sure. I mean, from my perspective, it is the underlying core cause of the polarization that we have, because, you know, when you gerrymander, what you're doing is putting your party, doing everything you can to give your party as many seats as possible so that you'll be in control. And in doing so, you know, you're trying to draw safe seats that you can win safely, regardless of where the ebb and flow of politics is in a particular year. And I think over time, what happens is a person who wins a safe district, and this is true whether it's a Democratic district or a Republican district, doesn't make any difference. But whoever wins that seat, over time, they figure out that the only people they really need to appeal to and talk to are the people in their party, because, and independents, of course, but mainly the people in their party. They don't really need to talk to the people in the other party because their vote's not going to matter. And so, but their fear becomes, if I don't, keep sort of moving to the left or to the right, whichever party it is, to keep as many people happy as I can, then somebody from my extreme is going to run against me. That's the fear, right? I mean, you hear legislators, members of Congress talk about it all the time, about getting primary. That's what they're worried about. So they have to protect their flank, not find a middle ground. But then once they get elected, oftentimes they find it hard to compromise, because the compromise, it seems weak, and it gives, again, a place where somebody to your extreme can attack you. And that makes the governing process in a democracy very, very hard, because it is built on the ability, I think, of people being able to come together and build a consensus, or at least build a middle ground where you can agree on a solution to a problem. And over time, because of partisan gerrymandering, I think we've driven this country to legislative bodies and congressional bodies that are made up of more people on the sort of extremes of both parties than we have that can help us forge compromise. And so I think it's really a key reason why we're as divided as we are.
So Art, you're a proud supporter of redistricting reform, and you've also contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to Republican candidates, and many who are actually in the leadership now who are not moving forward with redistricting reform. Can you tell us a little bit about how do you engage with those leaders, and what are you doing to try to encourage them to move into this area, to take motion?
Well, first, on part of your premise, the Republicans have passed nonpartisan redistricting reform. North Carolina House passed it in 2011. So that's the only time it's advanced at all in the 30, 40 some years it's been introduced. So there has been progress in advance. And there were Republican co-sponsors, even when Republican majority, including in the 2019 session, which I strongly supported. And unfortunately, it did not advance this time. And I think contributions have nothing to do with it. I think in 2019, that the Republicans were fairly confident they were going to stay in majority, and they were complying with the court-ordered redistricting from the Lewis lawsuit. And so why do we need to engage in this? Likewise, I think the Democrats in the legislature were some of them were confident, probably ended up being overconfident, they might retake the majority in the 2020 elections, and then they could fall back on the courts to do the redistricting for them. So that's where they saw their self-interest observe their majority. So I think that defeated the reform. And as far as donation, I'm glad you offer that. I know there's a lot of literature and websites out there about my donations. I'm not the biggest Republican donor over the last decade or 15, 20 years. And compared to Erskine Bowles, who spent $6 million on his campaign, John Edwards spent $6 million on his campaign, the donations, I'm sorry, I respectfully disagree. I think hopefully my record and criteria of having hands-on experience as a lawyer and legislator in past redistricting, what gives me more credibility, more hopefully be to an extent persuasive with the legislators, Democratic or Republican, than any donations I get.
Thank you for that. So quick follow-up question,
Yeah.
and I'll pose this to both of you. I'm wondering about the extent to which other sort of voting reforms, whether there's room for additional voting reforms under the efforts that you're taking now. So I'm thinking about efforts to move toward voter IDs or to limit early voting, for example. Are these the kinds of issues that you also see as relevant to this move toward democracy?
Okay. That's a whole nother set of issues. And again, I was vice chairman, Walter Jones, Jr., later congressman, was the Democratic chairman of election laws and constitutional amendments, and I was vice chairman back in '89 and been very involved in this. And we have seen a gradual expansion of the voting, the ease of voting, including same-day registration, early voting. Those were fairly novel concepts in 2008. And starting in 2008, the voter ID had been proposed back in 1989, way before these early issues. And some of the current controversy, I think, is way exacerbated by both sides. I do not think there was systematic stealing of elections in 2020. nor do I think was there systematic suppression of the vote efforts either. One principle is whatever the law is, it should be a uniform law, uniformly applied to the entire state and each precinct and each county that the votes are had. So for example, as an allegation of voter suppression in Texas is that the Texas legislature ended 24-hour voting in 2 counties. Well, Texas never had 24-hour voting before the pandemic, and 2 counties adopted it, and they thought it was the rest of Texas thought it was contrary to their state law, but the other counties didn't have it. So you'd have one set of voting rules for 2 counties, rather than one set of uniform rules. And Texas adopted a uniform of not having 24-hour voting for the entire state. So you can go through that entire list. I think it's good that we're having a debate on what are the best uniform rules, and they should be uniform rules. And I think the laws that North Carolina's adopted are less restrictive than many laws in states like New York and Delaware.
And so I think, our form of government is based upon the right to vote. It is supposed to be a government for the people and by the people, and the way the people express themselves is through their right to vote. So I think we ought to, together, both parties and independents, ought to come together and realize that if we want our form of government to survive and thrive, we ought to be encouraging every single citizen to vote in every single election, first of all. And we ought to be proud of that as a nation, that if we ever got to be the leader of percentage vote in democracies, we should be proud of it. We're not there, but we should work on it. And I think there have been efforts to restrict voting in some areas in the last 15, 20 years that are disturbing. But there also have been some innovations that I think have been good. And I think what we ought to do is look for ways to be sure we make voting easy and effective for everybody. Look, the people have spoken about a voter ID. We ought to be doing everything we can to be sure everybody gets an ID so that they're eligible to vote. The state ought to take that on as a responsibility. And we ought to do it. We ought not be going after boards of elections and secretaries of state in the way it's happening in some states, because people are trying to influence how they do their jobs. We all want them to be independent and do their jobs fairly. And in order to protect the integrity of our elections, because they've been under attack, certainly for the last several years, and that is very destructive for our form of government. So this is a place where I think the parties, they ought to be able to come together and publicly cry out, this is something we're going to do. We're going to protect the right to vote. Because I think, you can look at elections in North Carolina, and the historical sort of idea has been, for Republicans, if they suppress the turnout, they're going to win. And Democrats, if they get a big turnout, they're going to win. I don't know that the data supports that. I really don't. So if you believe that Republicans were suppressing the vote, they might be suppressing their own vote, truthfully. And that might end up hurting, because, I'm not so sure that a larger turnout, and some, there's some evidence that it actually helped Republicans. So, but that shouldn't matter. What should matter is everybody ought to be encouraged to vote, and then that's just a small way.
To add to that example, or specific example, in 1989, when I was on the Election Laws Committee, we passed DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles registration for people moving into North Carolina. It made sense when you get in your new driver, your new North Carolina resident, get your new driver's license, or you move within the state, get your new driver's license, do your voter registration at the time. A lot of Democrats thought that would favor them. But actually, the trend in the 1980s that more people moving to North Carolina were voting Republican than Democrat. And back then, areas like Cary, and talking about the 1980s, was a growing, booming metropolis and became Republican. By the way, now Cary shifted over more to on the Democratic side. So the election trends change. And I discussed this with Deondra earlier, but I'm going to go back to my old political science today. I'm a fan of John Rawls. If you take John Rawls' theory of the veil of ignorance and apply it to reality, adopt rules in advance that are best for the voters, best for the people, and you don't know what's going to benefit or hurt your political party. So that's why these laws, including redistricting, should be adopted in advance, agreed upon, and applied uniformly.
I love that. So one question for the follow-up for Art. What about Rawls's idea of redistributive justice? Like, I think a lot about, we're talking about the redistribution of political power. So if we really move forward with redistricting reform, we really could shake up the political landscape in a way that the principals who are currently in the ring might not be entirely comfortable with. So just wondering about your opinion on the prospects for getting current partisans involved in that kind of change.
I like to emphasize John Rawls' procedural justice. They actually touched upon that. If, one of my favorite examples, John Rawls said, if you want to cut a pie, and you're cutting the pie, you get the first piece, you cut half the pie for yourself. But you're cutting the pie and you get the last piece. So you're going to try to make the pieces as equally as possible, and then you're going to get the last piece. That's an example of procedural justice. And actually, the mathematician speaking earlier today talked about if you were responsible and drew 2 redistricting maps, and the majority party gets to draw them, but the minority party gets to pick them, then you would have the interest of doing math to be fair to you, whichever one gets adopted. So I do believe in procedural fairness, setting those rules ahead of time. And on redistribution, this gets into, again, the issue discussed yesterday by the mathematicians. I do strongly believe in the best representative democracy through single-member geographic districts. We don't have proportional representation. A lot of the European countries do, the United States does not. And in the litigation, this issue's been raised, and in the common cause, Lewis, the plaintiff said they were not seeking proportional representation, and the court said they weren't granting proportional representation. So I think you have to be careful when you're looking at the remedy, redistribution, distributive justice, that you don't go all the way full circle. From impartisan gerrymandering, but in order to impartisan gerrymandering, you need to look at the partisan results to see if it's proportional. Now that's different. I agree with what Tom said. I think you should do nonpartisan redistricting without having partisan data. Then yes, actually it's a tool we didn't have, the simulated math and algorithm drawing the maps. I think again, the mathematician said that really technology and application became available in 2015, 2016. Well, that wasn't available to the Republicans drawing maps in 2011 to check their map. Wasn't available to Democrats in 2001 or 91. So technology can be a help, we can check the results. But yes, in a representative democracy, the geographic district, our political system, the results are always not going to be proportional to the total vote.
Thank you so much. Okay, final word on that, Tom?
Well, I was just going to go back to the motor vehicles and say it's still got some problems because, you can only register to vote if you're actually doing something with your driver's license. If you just go into a Department of Motor Vehicles and ask to register to vote, you can't do it. They send you to the Board of Elections, well, that doesn't make much sense to me. Whereas if you say, I want to change the address on my driver's license and register to vote, you can do it. So there are lots of little things we could do in North Carolina and elsewhere to make access to voting easier. And if we're going to have voter IDs, which apparently the Constitution says that we are now, if it's upheld, then we ought to be doing everything we can to make that available to people. And it's easy to do now because you can upload your own photo. You can go to a drugstore and have a ID made. I mean, there are lots of places you can do it. And if the government worked with various outlets to be able to do it like they do for vaccines, then it wouldn't be impossible to get people voter IDs. But that's something the state ought to take on, in my opinion.
Thank you. So as much as I would like to dominate this conversation and ask you more questions, I know that our audience has plenty for you in person and over the Zoom webinar. So I see a hand right here in the front.
Yeah, so I'm a bit concerned with the efficacy of our first past the post system and truly getting rid of what gerrymandering is, because first past the post system, contrary to proportional representation, that leads to limited parties, 2 parties. And like James Madison talked about with factions in one of the Federalist Papers, politicians are going to try to do what they can to give themselves more power. Like Professor Rose said, that's what gerrymandering is, the redrawing of congressional districts to favor one party over another. That's what they're gonna do. So, I like what you guys said about introducing more, introducing more objectivity and nonpartisanship to the redistricting process, but how confident can we truly be in that system while having our first past the post system compounded by the rampant polarization, partially birthed by, like you said, gerrymandering?
Yeah, and that's what I said when asked the question of the gold standard. I think it's going to be very difficult to completely eliminate politics, right? And to completely eliminate gerrymandering. So the goal to me ought to be to limit it as much as possible. And that's when I was talking about Jonathan and the maps he draws and how he can, show us using math and the sort of variance between maps. And if you use really good criteria, that variance is going to be pretty small. And so that tells me we've eliminated a large amount of gerrymandering. We still have some, always will, but we've gotten rid of most of it. And if we can do that, get rid of most of the partisan gerrymandering, then I think we are, so much further down the road than we are today. I'll be for it. Now, is there going to be another jump down the road somewhere where we can completely eliminate it? Maybe. But it's going to, again, I think it might take artificial intelligence to figure out how to do that, which I don't have. So.
I am a strong proponent of the single member districts first past the post that we have. Respectfully, for proportional representation, you do get more parties like in European parliamentarian systems, but that's actually more factions. But also you strengthen the political party leadership. You get to pick who gets allocated the proportion seats. Single member district, you answer to your constituents, your voters. My district in 1989, well, the Democrats outnumber Republicans about 2-1, but I still won. Now it's answerable to my constituents, not to party leaders allocating you to that seat. But you need to have reasonable, fair districts based on neutral criteria rather than partisanship. So that's the solution I prefer.
So maybe I'll ask a question. Hi, I'm Jonathan Montgomery. I'm asking some of the online questions. So maybe just a quick follow-up on the theme you were just on. So I understand you were just talking against maybe a party system where parties dole out the seats. But what about multi-member systems? Well, multi-member districts? That's somewhere in between the two things you were saying. I guess people want to know a little bit what you think of that, both of you, and why was that included in the FAIR Act HB 140 when that was passed?
On multi-member districts, Wake County, which I represent, was originally most of its multi-member district and had been, I think, 5 or 6 members in the 1980s when I ran for office. After the Jingles case, which partly said you'd have single-member districts in order to allow minorities, in this case racial minorities, to elect candidates their choice, they found that was best on a single-member district because it's so easy in a multi-member district, especially when you can change the lines, that the minority gets totally, whether it's political minority, racial minority, language minority, gets totally subsumed by the bare majority. And also there's practicality of it. My district, I could do, when I ran in 1989, again, in the 90s, I could actually go door to door. I could go to the churches. I could do retail politics. If I had to run in Wake County and have 5 times the population, 11 times the population, then it makes it very hard for me as a candidate and as a serving legislator to represent my constituents when it's 11 times as many as there would be in a single member district, which would be the case for Wake County. And the cost of reaching out to 11 times as many voters.
Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about this because I think when we originally went to single member districts, for the reasons Art said, it was important that we do that to create opportunities for minorities who had been basically shut out of the political system to at least have some level of representation. But as we've seen, in our state and elsewhere in the country, huge demographic shifts, both in terms of, the makeup of the population, ethnic makeup and racial makeup, but also the distribution of the population now is vastly different than it was. And so I'm not sure the evils of multi member districts are as great as they once were in terms of assuming, particular populations. But I do think that's a risk. And so, I have to, I guess for me, it would almost be, somebody's got to prove to me that is going to solve a problem before I would go to it, because I'm not sure right now that we necessarily wouldn't be creating some other problems that we might not foresee.
So another question from online, an anonymous question asker. This year, speaking about this year, what have either of you done to reach out to the current leadership of either party, but the current legislatures, to try to push forward redistricting reform?
In 2021, you're talking about, as opposed to, so, because North Carolina for redistricting.
2020 also.
Yeah, North Carolina for redistricting reform, has been, we were created in 2019 and we worked extensively in 2020, to try to get a constitutional amendment passed. And I think we made some progress in convincing some people. And actually, if my co-chair Chuck McGrady were here, he would say that had it not been for the pandemic, that we might well have gotten something done. That we were at that moment that Art pointed out a few minutes ago, where neither party knew who was going to be in control. And so we had a shot at that time. And I think had the pandemic not completely consumed every legislative activity in the rest of the 2020 session, we were pretty close. We were going to have hearings and things look like they might well move, at least in the House and maybe even in the Senate. We were hearing positive things, but it didn't happen. And so, what we're now turning to is thinking, because look, the legislature, to their credit, in my view, are going to use the criteria and the rules that they were told to use by the court in 2020. Which, is another example of, I think, litigation making a difference in creating some level of reform. Not enough to satisfy me by any stretch, but at least some, if they follow the rules. Now, we'll see what they do. But so the question then becomes, there's not time to do a constitutional amendment or really much of anything to affect this redistricting cycle, because they have the data and they're in the process. But then, I'm not somebody who thinks we ought to wait till 2029 to start working on a constitutional amendment or any other reform that will apply in 2030. I think we ought to start right now. And we, our group is actually having conversations now about what can we do either after the maps are drawn this session, before the session ends, or next session, or the year after, or sometime during the next several years. What can we do to try to bring the parties together and get some sort of reform passed? And I think there's potential, because again, no one knows who will be in control in 2030. And the sooner we start on this, the less knowledge they'll have about who's going to be in control. But the other thing is, if you start at the beginning of the decade, a lot of the people that are currently in the legislature, they enter into the discussion knowing in their own minds they're not likely to be affected by it, right? They're not going to be there. Whereas if you're doing it the year before, it affects them personally. So that improves your chances also. So I think we ought to put a real push on for some reform after they've drawn the maps this year.
I hate to disappoint my not fan club on social media and some of the websites, but I had a single conversation with legislators about redistricting in 2021, literally. Not acted as a lawyer, not acted as an advisor. So this cycle, I've got plenty to do in life that I've not been directly involved. In 2020, this may further disappoint people. Yes, I did. I picked up the phone, talked to legislators on both the Republican and Democratic side. Some of the Democratic leadership I served with in the North Carolina House back in the 89 and 99 sessions. We've been through these issues beforehand, shared common goals. And so I talked to Democrats as well as Republicans, urging them to push forward, making the arguments to them that I made today. Going forward from here, this was the case in 2011. Because nonpartisan redistricting was not adopted in 2009 and 10, the Democrats had a majority. It was too late for a constitutional amendment to govern it in 2011. And we direct, a lot of Republicans thought, well, the Democrats have been doing redistricting for years, for decades, for centuries. So why should we give up our responsibility, our authority, our power to do it? We think we're going to do a better job than the Democrats did, and I think they did a better job than the Democrats did, but they weren't going to give it up. Unfortunately, in that same situation, as Tom just said, for 2021, it's too late for a constitutional amendment. And they think they can comply with the law following the rules and process that the trial court gave in the Lewis litigation last year, so that's what they're doing. But absolutely, what Tom also just said, we need to start working today for a constitutional amendment that's going to be effective for the next round of redistricting, and or if there's going to be any court order redistricting in 2025 or 2027 or 2029, we have so much mid-decade redistricting due to litigation. Not knowing who's going to be majority and not knowing now who in 2020, 31 is going to be the majority, it's the best time to pass it. And yes, I think you may get some senior statesmen like Chuck McGrady, who pretty well knew he was going to come back and do what he thought was best, even if it may hurt his actual district for himself.
Yeah, so I don't know that I'll agree with Art on everything today, including the statement that the Republicans did a better job than the Democrats. But having said that, I do think that there is an ample amount of hypocrisy to be laid upon the feet of both parties. I mean, this has been an issue in which the Democrats absolutely opposed nonpartisan redistricting when they were in control, and the Republicans favored it. And then when the Republicans got control, they forgot that they had been in favor of it, and the Democrats all of a sudden realized it was a great thing. So both parties have been, as hypocritical as possible on this issue. And that's why I think starting early in the decade and starting when you don't know who's going to be in control and you don't even know who's going to be in the legislature 10 years from now, that's another moment, just like a moment when, you're close to an election and nobody knows who's going to be in control. That's a moment when maybe something's possible. And that's what we ought to focus on. This is not an issue that is new. It has been with us certainly since, the 70s, if not going back to Baker versus Carr. Which, I think the Supreme Court case is inconsistent with, by the way. But in any event, this is a long-term problem. So you got to think about long-term solutions. And if we can't fix it this time, let's fix it for 2030 and hope the democracy is still around to benefit.
I think we have time for one final question.
Well, hopefully it'll, should be short because you already partially answered it for the long-term strategy. But do you see any room for progress, this redistricting cycle?
Well, it depends on how you find progress. So let me tell you one thing that I think is very helpful, which is our group is not only work at the state level, but we're working at the local level, and we're working with a number of communities, whether it's municipalities that are doing redistricting, school boards, county commissions, all around the state that have asked us to come in and help them. We're offering them a service at a far lower rate than they might get from some big law firm, but they have to agree to follow the criteria that we have laid out, which is not using political data. And so what we're trying to do is prevent some of the partisanship from reaching the local level. We've already seen the legislature intervene in a couple of places and try to order redistricting that suits their party at the local level, but we're trying to prevent that as much as we can by upfront getting people on board with the idea, and it's working quite well. So I think that's positive. I think the fact that the legislature has agreed publicly to follow the rules that the court set in 2020 is a positive development. Now, whether or not they will do it, I don't know. I don't think it was a perfect solution last time, but I think it was a lot better than it was before. So that I think is positive. Beyond that, I think it's going to be really hard to see much, except I'm hopeful that because there will be hopefully some period of time between when the maps become public and they actually get brought to the floor for a vote, the ability of people to do, some analysis quickly to show, alternatives that might be fair and put those out there might alter the discussions a bit, I hope. So, Jonathan's back there nodding, because he knows he's gonna have to do a lot of work to pump out as many maps as he can to try to show, the variances so that we know that these are really fair districts. And reverse engineer what the legislature did, frankly, and see if they violated rules and used political data or whatever. I think that's possible. So, I'm still hopeful we'll come out of this with fairer maps than we've had before. And I think the other thing is, if you don't know if you can't look at political data, right? I listened to Rebecca Tibbett, who's a demographer over at Chapel Hill, excellent, talk about the census findings as we know them so far. And the real outcome of this census, more than anything, is we don't know where people are. We can't assume that politics are going to be like they were in 2010 with this census, because people, we have a huge more than 1 million people come into the state. The suburbs don't look anything like they did in 2010. They're demographically vastly different. The percentage of people of color in this state has gone up, although, not to the same extent. That a lot of them are not voting population, no voting age. And so, those demographics are a little different, the voting population, but, there's so much difference. Then if they don't use partisan data, I think we're more likely to get fairer districts myself. So, I'm optimistic, but not satisfied.
To go back to my original thing, in an agreement with Tom, there has been progress. Redistricting reform through legislation and constitutional amendment has not succeeded. That's obvious. Redistricting reform through litigation has made progress. In the Shaw case, limiting racial gerrymandering had been narrowly tailored. The Stevenson case for legislative districts, the whole county single-member districts. So there has been progress. The progress under this last round of litigation, we could have a whole hour day on the Common Cause v. Lewis, but that was a trial court decision. The trial court itself said it was a case of first impression applying the free election clause, and it expressly said it was limiting its decision to the facts before it, not trying to set standards for future redistricting, either the standards or the process. So Lewis is not binding on this legislature or future legislature. That's why we do need to go back, get in constitutional amendment, put forward to people to be approved by the people rather than the constant litigation. And there's still areas of law that are rather uncertain, especially in what constitutes a Voting Rights Act district, crossover district, coalition district, influence district. The Lewis case based its ruling in part on, quote, extreme gerrymandering, extreme partisan gerrymandering. So it's a little bit of partisan gerrymandering. Okay, where do you draw that line? These are unclear issues which need to be resolved again through a constitutional amendment. But one big progress, and I do think that the Republicans did a better job in the 2011, this decade, than the Democrats did in 92, the 90s, and the 2000s. But the good point is that the Republicans supported redistricting reform in 1989, including myself. We still support it. We've been a minority. We know we can be a minority. We think this is a better way to go. Democrats who never saw the need for it, and their allies who never saw the need for it, did become converts in 2011. There was support on both sides of the aisle, not enough to get it passed, but support on both sides of the aisle for redistricting reform this last year before the census was done in the new election. So hopefully now that the Democrats and their allies realize they can be a minority, Republicans realize they can be a minority, and to the extent you think that the North Carolina courts are partisan in their decision, or federal courts are partisan in their decision, those majorities change too. So having learned that lesson, maybe both sides, both parties and their allies will support redistricting reform.
Thank you so much, and we will have to, any final point, Tom? Well, then we will leave it there, and I hope you will join me in thanking our coach and our moderator. And I want to also, on behalf of Paula Center for Politics and the Duke Math Department, give some very quick thanks to Professor Asher Hildebrand, our architect of this. Thank you so much, Asher. To our Duke Math colleagues, Jonathan Nelly and Gregory Hirschlag, Thank you so much for everything that you have for putting this and making it reality, to our generous supporters and co-sponsors, to the Sanford School of Public Policy and Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, and to Team Paulus, Meg Biddle, Braden Hannon, the Paulus Directors Fellows, and a wonderful group of Duke undergraduate and graduate students who are volunteering to make this entire conference a reality. And to all of you, thank you so much for being with us today. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, we hope that those of you who are here and on Zoom will join us for our next session, which starts at 1:30. And the title is The State of Play in North Carolina, where analysts will discuss the redistricting process as it currently is unfolding in North Carolina, and then preview its legal and political implications. To see the full schedule of our events for the rest of today, please visit paulus.duke.edu/redistricting. And we hope to also see our guests at our reception outside between Sanford and Rubenstein this afternoon at 4:15. So hope to see you there. Thank you all so much.